I met Edward 10 years ago in the dusty, fluorescent-lit hallways of our elite private high school, right after the boy I believed to be my absolute soulmate dumped me for a vapid, glittering pageant queen. The scent of cheap floor wax and stale locker room sweat mingled with the suffocating aroma of my own sudden, humiliating irrelevance. I was Rose, the richest girl in town, the undisputed queen of our social hierarchy, and I had just been publicly discarded. My bruised ego required an immediate, drastic remedy. That was when I saw him. Edward's family was so agonizingly poor, he was practically transparent, a phantom haunting the corridors in threadbare sweaters and scuffed sneakers that had been meticulously, desperately glued back together. He was a scholarship student, a brilliant anomaly drowning in a sea of trust funds. I stepped in, not out of the goodness of my heart, but because I recognized a vacuum I could fill. I paid his exorbitant school fees, ensuring the administration turned a blind eye to my abysmal attendance and plummeting grades. I didn't do it out of kindness. I did it because I wanted a slave. To me, his entire education, the very foundation of his future, cost less than my weekly allowance. He was brilliant in a way that made my own privileged mind feel utterly stagnant. He did my advanced calculus tests, wrote my sprawling literature papers on books I never cracked open, and flawlessly engineered projects that ensured I graduated at the very top of my class. I basked in the unearned applause, walking across the graduation stage with a valedictorian medal around my neck, while Edward sat in the back row, clapping quietly for the success he had forged with his own exhausted hands. Thanks to his invisible, relentless labor, I sailed through university and subsequently landed an incredibly lucrative CFO position at my family's massive real estate and logistics firm. I was earning more than enough to fuel my spoiled, high-fashion lifestyle, dripping in diamonds and cloaked in seasonal couture. Edward, meanwhile, was wasting away in the damp, windowless basement of the sprawling mansion I eventually bought for myself. He was pouring his soul into a pathetic tech startup he'd built amidst exposed pipes and concrete walls. He earned so little from his obscure coding projects that he couldn't even afford a seat at the lavish, Michelin-starred restaurants I frequented every single weekend with my glittering, superficial entourage. Last year, the specter of my past returned. My so-called soulmate came back into the picture, his name suddenly appearing in my notifications and his face popping up in my social circles. I immediately fell back into his orbit. We were out every night, drowning in champagne and neon lights, leaving Edward at home like a loyal dog at an animal shelter, waiting patiently by the door for a master who never intended to come home. The sheer cruelty of my indifference never even registered in my mind. Edward was just furniture, a fixture of my life that I assumed would never break or leave. I only married Edward to make my ex jealous after a spectacularly petty argument. I thought it would be the ultimate power move, a declaration that I could have unconditional devotion whenever I snapped my manicured fingers. But my ex didn't even blink. He barely noticed my grand, spiteful gesture. For a year, I treated our marriage like a prison sentence. I refused to be intimate. The mere thought of touching someone so low, someone who smelled of basement dampness and cheap coffee, disgusted me to my core. I made him sign a draconian prenuptial agreement that ensured he'd never see a single cent of my massive fortune. After all, I owned him. He was a pet. Or so I arrogantly thought. Then came the morning the tectonic plates of my life began to shift. I walked downstairs, wrapping a silk designer robe tightly around my waist, assaulted by the smell of a breakfast so divine it almost made me stay. The aroma of perfectly poached eggs, rich hollandaise sauce, and sizzling cured bacon wafted through the vast marble-clad kitchen. But the moment I saw Edward's face, that familiar, cloying pet devotion swimming in his tired, gentle eyes, I felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of nausea. He stood there holding a silver spatula, looking at me as if I were the sun breaking through the clouds. "I have a headache from the club," I snapped, my voice echoing coldly off the marble countertops. I turned on my designer heel, leaving his painstaking cooking to grow cold and unloved on the dining table. That afternoon, sitting in my sprawling corner office overlooking the city skyline, a group chat notification changed everything. My ex had returned from the USA, and he hadn't just returned. He was armed with a PhD and a supposed wealth of new connections. My heart raced, a frantic, desperate drumming against my ribs. I spent the entire day obsessively researching him, scrolling through his polished social media profiles, completely convinced by my own delusions that we were destined to be together. The universe was giving me a second chance. I practically sprinted home. I threw hastily printed divorce papers directly into Edward's face without a single word of explanation, watching the crisp white sheets flutter to the hardwood floor. I didn't wait for his reaction. I immediately began prepping for an exclusive, diamond-tier corporate gala where I knew my soulmate would be in attendance. I was 1,000% sure Edward wouldn't sign those papers. He was a simp. He was completely obsessed with me. I assumed he would play hard to get, or beg on his knees just to keep my attention, just to remain in the periphery of my radiant life. At the party, beneath chandeliers that dripped with Austrian crystal, my ex was everything Edward wasn't: rich, staggeringly handsome, and socially famous. His smile was a weapon, and I walked right into it. We rekindled everything that night, sneaking into alcoves, sharing breathless promises, and engaging in the very intimacy I had so strictly denied my actual husband. Intoxicated by the champagne and the thrill of the illicit, I decided to force the divorce. I wanted Edward to break. I did something truly monstrous. I took intimate, undeniable photos of us together in the dim lighting of a very important person lounge and sent them directly to Edward's phone. When I walked through the heavy oak door of my mansion later that night, the house was suffocatingly quiet. Edward was sitting in the massive living room, bathed in the harsh blue light of our 115-inch TV. The screen was on, but he wasn't watching it. He looked up at me with those watery, puppy eyes, the eyes of a creature that had finally understood it was being led to the slaughter. But he didn't say a word. There was no screaming, no shattering of glass, no frantic, tearful questions about the photos that had surely destroyed his world. There was just silence, a heavy, terrifying silence that I misread as pathetic submission. Over the next 2 agonizing months, my soulmate started to feel more and more like a heavy, sinking liability. Every lavish date, every luxury purchase, every massive investment for his supposed new IT firm came directly out of my bleeding pockets. He spun tales of temporary cash flow issues and international wire delays. I blindly told myself he was just testing me, testing my devotion to our destined love. But the bills were mounting to catastrophic heights. Back home, Edward was a ghost. He worked incredibly late, his footsteps barely making a sound on the stairs. He slept on a small cot in his basement office, entirely avoiding the master suite. Yet, he still made breakfasts I continued to viciously insult. "Stop wasting food," I screamed at him one morning, my stress over my maxed-out credit cards boiling over into irrational rage. I swept a plate of perfectly flipped pancakes into the trash. "Nobody wants your disgusted cooking. You're pathetic." He looked at the trash can, then slowly up at me. His eyes were empty. He quietly took off his apron, draped it over a stool, and walked down into the basement. He never ate at home again. He never cooked for me again. Then, the floor fell through. I received an anonymous message containing undeniable photos of my soulmate entering a lavish hotel suite with 2 other women. The world spun. I rushed to his downtown penthouse apartment, ready to demand answers, only to be violently slapped into reality. The doorman casually informed me he was moving out. I bypassed security, and found the apartment empty save for a few boxes. He had completely used me for my money. My corporate and personal credit cards were maxed out beyond repair. My savings were drained into his fake offshore IT accounts. And the soulmate I'd chased for a decade was nothing but a calculated, predatory fraud. Distraught, stripped of my pride, my wealth, and my sanity, I drove to the city's suspension bridge. The rain was pouring in relentless, freezing sheets, soaking through my thin designer dress. I stood at the edge, staring down at the churning, black water below, completely ready to end it all. The wind howled, a reflection of my own internal screaming. But then, a hand grabbed my shoulder, ripping me backward onto the wet asphalt. Edward appeared out of the storm like a prince on a white horse, breathless, completely soaked, his chest heaving. Before I could speak, before I could sob, he did something he had never done in the 10 years I had known him. He slapped me. It wasn't a slap of hatred, but a sharp, stinging shock that brought me back to my senses. He pulled me forcefully into his chest, holding me so tightly I could hear his own heartbeat hammering against mine. His eyes were nearly crying, filled with an indescribable mixture of anger and absolute heartbreak. He didn't speak. He just picked me up, carried me to his beat-up sedan, and took me home. I woke up the next morning in the master bedroom, the rain still gently tapping against the glass. I expected to see him downstairs. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to tell him I finally understood. But the house was entirely, deafeningly empty. The scent of coffee was gone. The hum of the basement servers was dead. I rushed to his closet. His clothes were gone. Then my phone rang. It was my lawyer. "The divorce is finalized, Rose," the voice crackled through the speaker. "Edward signed everything late last night, waived all rights to alimony or property. You're officially single." My phone slipped from my fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. My heart dropped into an endless abyss. The pet had finally realized the cage door was open, and he had left. What followed was a week where my world systematically collapsed. Without Edward's invisible, guiding hand managing my personal finances and covering up my corporate blunders, everything fell apart. My family's company was facing mass layoffs due to a massive logistical error I had completely missed. My job as CFO was directly on the line unless I could secure a miraculous deal with a new, mysterious multi-billion-dollar AI conglomerate that had just swept the global market. I was drowning in insurmountable debt from my ex's fraud. The sprawling mansion felt like a tomb. My superficial housemates and friends had vanished the moment the champagne stopped flowing. I stood in my vast, state-of-the-art kitchen and realized, with a wave of absolute, crushing despair, that I couldn't even figure out how to boil water for a package of instant ramen. I sat on the cold floor in the dark, sobbing, finally understanding that Edward had been the invisible foundation keeping my entire life afloat for a decade. The day of the big meeting arrived. I sat in the glass-walled conference room, desperate, sweating through my blazer, and wildly unprepared. Our competitors sat across from us, sharks smelling blood in the water, all of us waiting with bated breath for the mysterious AI genius CEO to arrive. The heavy oak double doors slowly opened. The room fell dead silent. I saw a man step into the room, flanked by corporate lawyers and assistants. He was wearing a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit, his hair immaculately styled, radiating an aura of untouchable power and quiet confidence. It wasn't just a CEO, it was Edward. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up involuntarily, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. Panic, shame, and disbelief washed over me in a tidal wave. I turned toward the side exit, desperate to flee before he could see me, before he could exact his entirely justified revenge. "Where are you going, Mrs. Rose?" His voice echoed through the vast room. It was smooth, authoritative, lacking any of the timid hesitation I was so used to. I froze. I was completely speechless. The man I had relentlessly mocked, the man I had forced to sleep on a basement cot, the man I had called a miserable failure, was the unparalleled genius who had quietly built a billion-dollar empire in the very damp, concrete basement I had continually ridiculed. Everyone in the room, knowing our history from industry gossip, expected him to crush me. They waited for the execution, but Edward simply walked to the head of the table, looked around the room, and calmly announced that he would sign the exclusive logistics deal with my company. He cited our established infrastructure and market reach, keeping it entirely professional. My boss cheered loudly, clapping me on the back. Our competitors were left stunned and utterly defeated. After the meeting, I couldn't let it end like that. I ran out of the building, my heels clicking frantically against the pavement, and stopped him just as he was about to step into a sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom. I grabbed his arm. I poured my heart out, tears ruining my expensive makeup. I told him how my ex had destroyed me, how I had been blind, how I needed him. I begged, hoping against hope for a tiny spark of the old pet loyalty to flare up in his eyes. He stood there, the city breeze ruffling his perfect suit. He listened to my hysterical rambling, nodding slowly. But his eyes were no longer those of a devoted puppy. They were the eyes of a man looking at a stranger. "I'm seeing someone now, Rose," he said gently, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow hurt even more. "A woman who treats me like a human being, not a pet. She asks about my day. She respects my work." He gently removed my hand from his arm. "It's good you finally realized that people only loved you for your lifestyle. I truly hope you find someone who loves you the way I used to love you." He got into the back seat of the car. The heavy door clicked shut with an expensive absolute finality. He drove away, merging into the bustling city traffic until the car was just another speck in the distance. I stood alone on the cold pavement, a successful CFO with a secured multi-million-dollar deal, a maxed-out credit score, and a completely hollow chest. In that moment, looking at my reflection in the glass of the corporate high-rise, I finally realized the devastating truth. The only man who had ever genuinely loved me for me, beneath the wealth and the cruelty, was the one I had meticulously trained to leave.
Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing and liking our videos for more emotional stories.